Good morning, everyone. We're going to call this meeting to order. In order to do so, I need to determine a quorum. Board members, I'll go around and call your name. If you will, please say here or I. Mr. Smith?
Here.
Mr. Hall?
Here.
Mr. George?
Here.
Ms. Burns? Here. And myself, Cindy Fontana. At this time, we need to approve the agenda as presented. Who would like to make that motion?
I make a motion that we approve the agenda as presented.
Ms. Burns has made the motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second, Mr. George.
Mr. George is seconding. All in favor. Once again, I'll call everyone's name. Mr. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Smith?
Yes.
Ms. Burns?
Yes.
And Mr. George?
Yes.
At this time, we need to have a motion made in order to go into closed session. Who would like to make that motion?
Madam Chair, this is Mr. George. I'll make the motion. Pender County Board of Education will enter closed session subject to the advice from the attorney pursuant to North Carolina General Statute 143-31811A1 and A6 to prevent the disclosure of confidential personnel information under General Statute 115C-319 and to consider matters related to initial employment of an individual employee. The board will also go into closed session pursuant to General Statute 143-31811A3 to consult with the board's attorney in order to preserve the attorney-client privilege to consider confidential student matters as provided in North Carolina General Statute 143-31811A1 and the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act 20 U.S.C. 123G and North Carolina General Statute 115C-402.
Thank you. Mr. George has made the motion. Do we have a second?
Second the motion.
Mr. Smith is seconding. All in favor. Once again, I'll go around and call your name. Mr. Hall?
Yes.
Ms. Burns?
Yes.
Mr. George?
Yes.
Mr. Smith?
Yes.
All right, so carried. At this time, we are now entering into closed session.
We're back live.
All right, at this time, we are now coming out of closed session, and we are moving into the action part of our agenda. Moving on to item COVID-19 testing processes. Dr. Hill?
Yes, ma'am. We'll have an information session led by Dr. Blumenwright and his team.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the board, and Health Department. So, upon request, we've provided some information regarding the MAKO testing process as articulated this past week regarding the K-12 testing processes, the testing models, screening versus diagnostic, and then the timeline of how that would play out. We are ready to move forward, but also based upon requested information. You'll see in a handout that was sent to you information from two districts, both Brunswick and Barnett, regarding MAKO labs and state contracting processes. So it is a process. It's step by step. And we are ready to do what you would like. And are there any questions about the testing process as articulated in that handout?
Blumenwright, you may want to give just a brief overview of what the process would look like, maybe just a minute or two.
Absolutely. So to start the testing process, if we decide to move forward with engaging MAKO labs, we would need to, first of all, create accounts for all the schools that would be in our system and appropriate for testing. The next step would be then to develop a detailed plan specific to each school, because things may vary from point to point depending upon circumstances at each particular site. The third step would be to then move forward with a one-time pre-registration process and consent with students and staff. So testing would not occur except without consent, and that is a very important thing. So we would need to have those permissions completed on the front end. And the next step after that would be to finalize a testing schedule for each particular site. Again, that is dependent on circumstances. We would need to obtain school-level CLIA waivers if we went with MAKO labs for all of the sites that we are testing at. And then lastly, we would move forward with supplies being sent to the test sites. And so specific to that process, there are two types of testing models. There's a screening testing model and a diagnostic testing model. And the diagnostic is when we engaged with the two LEAs, or the two, that was the specific model that they were really engaged in. So you have that information specific to rapid test versus PCR tests and things of that nature. And then, of course, once we decide about which particular model and process we would engage in as appropriate, then we would need to kind of move forward with getting, from the very beginning, getting the accounts and the parental consents and the school and district processes onboarded. So that's basically it in a nutshell.
Thank you. So a summative is we're focusing on diagnostic testing to offer volunteer testing at our school sites.
Correct.
Thank you, sir. Board, are there any specific questions?
This is Beth Burns. What would be the cost of this?
Our understanding is the cost is picked up by the state with funds through grants that are granted at the state level. So no cost to parents, families, etc.
Okay, and what would their turnaround time be?
In terms of full implementation of the program, or through the actual testing?
I'm sorry, for the actual And Will, and you brought up a good point there too. What would, as far as setup time also?
All right, so let's start with the setup time. In speaking with the two other districts, they had started the process, the onboarding process in August. And so it is right now at the beginning of October that they are really ramping up with their diagnostic processing. So we're looking at a delay of probably a couple of months, but we can kind of get that process started. We've got that information. If you take a look at that handout, we've got that kind of process at the other two districts, the way that it was laid out. So we are looking at probably a couple of months. Now, specific to the diagnostic process, the PCR testing, according to Mako Labs, we get the results within 24 hours. So there's a pretty quick turnaround on that. Does that answer your question, Ms. Burns?
Yes, sir, but I mean, we're looking at 2 months for them to get set up within our schools.
Well, that's the way it was with the two LEAs because they had some lead time. I do think that with the with it already having been implemented, sometimes at the beginning of programs like this, it takes a little bit of time. There does not seem to be an issue specific to Mako Labs, if that's the kind of the thrust of the question. There are some questions about some of the funding processes at the state level, but those are more questions that we kind of would need to work through. But Mako Labs, everybody had nothing but wonderful things to say about the implementation of the process in terms of them being on site, being ready to go, being ready to do the work. And I'm going to bring Kim Collins up here for just a moment. She can speak to some of the other processes specifically.
Good morning. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. And this information came from the other two school systems that are implementing this currently with Mako. I think that Mako is able to start the process pretty quickly. I think the part that was holding both of these counties up is the funding from the state and the state contracts. So, and the other thing I wanted to clarify is if we only do the diagnostic PCRs versus the rapid and then the PCR, we do not have to have an additional CLIA waiver for that. Any questions?
So we could start immediately doing the PCR while we wait on our CLIA for the other. Is that possible?
That's a possibility.
Board members, the reason we had the special, I'm sorry, I was letting them know, the reason we had the special meeting today was when we were talking to me and Ms. Fontana was on the conference call the other day with the Mako rep. He said if we were to let them know by Friday that they would start building the website on Friday and have us set up ready to go early next week. So that's why it was the special meeting was called for today to try to rush us ahead if we decide to go that route. They did offer the 24-hour turnaround time. They have a carrier system that picks up at the schools each afternoon of the day that the school has a test that day. They'll pick it up, take it to their lab, and he said a lot of times they have the results back before school starts the next morning. They have labs, I guess, across North Carolina. So it's a very quick turnaround time for the PCR test.
Right. I think, and like I said before, I think where these other two counties have been delayed is, there are forms and things that have to be filled out, and as far as getting the account set up with Mako, and then the state contracts is where they both felt like their delay had been. And that's because of the funding that is tied to this.
Was that, you know if that was for testing funding or is that for additional staffing funding?
That's both, staffing, mainly. They both have hired, staffing agencies, nurses through staffing agencies in all of their schools. And so I think that's, they are waiting on some funding to be able to, to get that going, for those folks to be able to do the testing.
So I think also in that meeting the other day when we talked about it, it wouldn't necessarily have to be a nurse who would have to perform that test. I guess I'm concerned about those schools that share nurses and how that would work. Mr. George, isn't that what I understood also, that we didn't necessarily have to have a nurse because of the swab and how it doesn't go up as far, and it would just have to be somebody, have to be trained. And Ms. Steele and your department, didn't y'all say it wouldn't take long for somebody to be trained to do that?
Yes, we did say that other people, nurses, other people other than nurses can be trained, and it doesn't go up very far, and it should not take very long to train others.
Well, and Dr. Hill, the reason I'm bringing this up is because if you remember a while back, we talked about, and this was before we had turned the quarantines and isolations over to the health department, but we had talked about using some of our ESSERS money to look at possible people or staff that we presently have, such as bus drivers or others, who can maybe do, help with contact tracing at the time. And I'm just wondering if that would be a possibility for some of these, so that it would move the process along. I happen to know bus drivers who I think would want to jump on that and would do a really good job of that. So I guess that's my question.
Yes, ma'am, we can look into it, and as long as the health department and everybody agrees that they're trained adequately, then we'll meet whatever certification level they need. We'll make it happen.
Yeah, I guess I'm just more, I know that one of the problems that we've heard from other counties is waiting on the money for, or positions or whatever from the state. And that's a way we could kind of prohibit some of that for the short term. Even if it is for the short term, we would have somebody who could help out, especially at those schools that we don't have full-time nurses right now, or they're back and forth. We split them between schools. I guess something to think about. I don't know what other board members' thoughts are, but that's just my thought I'm throwing out there.
Hey, this is the health department. I'm sorry. Just so we have a little more clarification here. So are you guys looking at thinking Mako and then you'll do the PCR and you'll just swab them and send those out? Is that what you're thinking at this point? I'm sorry, it's been a little hard for us to follow here.
Madam Chair, this is Mr. George. I'll speak to what I had the question still. Could we start with, they were talking about we were having a delay in getting the CLIA certifications to do the rapid test. My question was if we could do the PCR, they said we didn't need that for the PCR test. My question was, could we start with the PCR test and be doing those until we got certified to do the rapid test?
Sounds like a great idea, especially with your turnaround being so quick.
So eventually we would hopefully be able to do, the rapid test once we got certified in a month or so.
I have one more question. Are we looking at just testing symptomatic, or are we looking at also testing exposures that they can come on the 5th day and get tested? What are you doing? Who are you testing?
This is Mr. George again. This is just me speaking personally. I would like to test symptomatic and then the exposures, because that seems to be the ones that we're having trouble finding testing sites for, is the ones that want to come back, that's been exposed, and we can't find the testing, so they can't find testing sites, or if they find a testing site, it's costing them $150+
I'm sorry, it's Shirley again. If
Go
your
ahead,
staff,
Chris.
if you guys have the staff and can get some other people trained, that's a great idea. It sure will take a lot of stress off of these parents and maybe make things a little easier for everybody as far as keeping kids in school.
I have a question, Cindy, just to follow up. This is to make, no test can be done unless the parent gives approval. So we're not saying that a child to be tested or just on our own whim that they look like they've got sickness in their eyes, that we're going to go test them. The parent would have to approve this, correct?
Yeah, as far as I know, is that correct, Todd?
Yes, ma'am.
Kim?
Yes.
Yeah,
Depends on parental consent.
right. And I'm just gonna put my mama hat on here for a minute and tell you that as a parent, I would be ready to sign up today for that, because I think as a parent, it's like Mr. George said, you don't have to seek and find a place and have to be worried about, oh gosh, what am I going to do? When am I going to do it? And how am I going to do this? It just takes a couple of those steps off the parent's plate, and I think that would be a great thing. That's just my personal opinion. Mr. Hall, do you have any comments or questions or concerns?
No, I do not.
Okay. Ms. Burns, anything else?
I have to be honest with you, no cost and a 24-hour turnaround. This could be the answer we've been looking for, because I know that there has been a lot of trouble finding just even to get the kit or to get a test. And I'm like Mr. George said, I'm hearing $150 for a COVID test. I mean, that's rather ridiculous. So to me, this seems like a win-win.
All right, Mr. Smith, what do you think?
I support it as long as, like I said, my only concern was I just don't want any kid to be pulled off to the side and tested without a parent knowing about it and giving full consent. So if that can be assured, then I think it's a win situation.
Okay. Mr. George, any other comments or concerns?
I don't.
All right, so from what I understand, this is an action item, we need to make a motion, but I'm assuming, Brandon, that when we make the motion, we have to put in there like what this testing would be for and all of that, correct?
I think that's a good idea for the public listening.
Okay.
And Mr. Bloomer may be able to help you with that motion as far as what.
Okay.
So Madam Chair, I would probably recommend, if you want to move forward with this option, would be to phrase it something along the lines of to approve moving forward with the contacting and providing of information to Mako Labs to initiate the testing process, diagnostic testing process as articulated.
Is there a board member who wrote all that down so you can make that motion?
And Madam Chair, we can go as formal as informal as you want, but if somebody can simply say, I make the motion just made by Mr. Bloomer. I just want the words to be out there, so.
Okay. All right. So at this time, do we have a board member who'd like to make the motion?
Madam Chair, I'd like to just make a friendly amendment to that motion to clarify that this is strictly voluntary, only with parental consent.
Correct.
friendly motion, I'll make a motion to approve.
Okay, Mr. George, go ahead.
And with that amendment, I'd like to make a second to the motion, ma'am.
All right, so Mr. George has made the motion. Mr. Smith is now seconded. All in favor, Mr. Hall?
Yes.
Ms. Burns? Yes. Once again, Mr. George?
Yes.
And Mr. Smith?
Yes.
All right, so carried. At this time, we need to make motion to adjourn the meeting.
Madam Chair, this is Shirley. Can I just share one quick thing with you?
I think so. Can we do that? Brandon, can she do that or not now at this point?
It depends on what the topic is, Ms. Shirley.
With this information to tell you about the new strong school toolkit that came out new today, updated. That's all.
Okay.
And
Yeah. So,
thing.
point of information. Madam Chair, I don't see a problem with it.
You don't see a problem with it?
No, ma'am, not at this time. If it's just a point of information to let us, let the community and the board know that, that's fine.
Okay. All right, Ms. Steele, go ahead.
They just sent out an updated strong schools toolkit that was sent out. It's dated actually October the 5th. And the only change there's a couple little things, but the biggest change that was noted in there, and they did mark the changes in red, is that, and this doesn't really apply to us at this point because we're not mandating math, but in the past when we were having the mask mandate, and if kids in a classroom came in contact with each other and one was positive, then the kids did not have to quarantine. They have now removed the exclusion from it, where beforehand it did not apply to teachers, staff, or other adults in the indoor classroom setting. So they did remove that sentence that if we were to go back to masks and everybody was masked up, then the teachers and staff would not have to go home either, would not be excluded. Just wanted to let you guys know that.
Okay. All right, thank you, ma'am. All right, so at this time, do we have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Madam Chair, I'll make a motion to adjourn. Mr. George.
Mr. George has made the motion. Do we have a second? I'll second. Ms. Burns is seconded. All in favor, Mr. Smith?
Yes.
Mr. Hall?
Yes.
Ms. Burns? Yes. And Mr. George?
Yes.